Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, challenge. As you can see, I am here by myself. My colleague and partner, Peter Lavelle, is indisposed. So as we made our commitment to the Gaggle, and we made an absolutely axiomatic principle that come rain, come shine, come heat wave, ice vortex, whatever, we will always be here. And we're going to stick to that commitment. And basically, that's our policy. And even I am not above that policy. So here I am. And welcome to Nigel, Herman Montoya, Kiro Luis, who's from Brazil, and I know Nigel is from the UK. Not quite sure, Herman, where you're from. I mean, I think I think you probably identified your location before, but I can't remember exactly. Herman has already brought up the subject of Julian Assange, which is in fact what I wanted to start off with, because of course yesterday overturned the decision of the lower court, which had denied the United States extradition request. So if you remember, the lower court had ruled that although it had found in favor of the United States on almost every issue, as to its jurisdiction and the fact that this was perfectly proper extradition. This wasn't a matter of political trial or whatever. Very, very dubious. But it balked. The lower court balked at the prospect of Assange being sent to a maximum security prison, the so-called Supermax. And being put under special administrative measures, which would also involve held in isolation. So she said, given Assange's mental state, given his proneness to depression, she felt that she couldn't grant the Americans extradition request. Of course, the United States promptly appealed. This was the Biden administration. So the original extradition request came under the Trump administration, but her ruling came early January. So by the time the United States filed its appeal, now the Biden administration was in power. Anyway, they challenged the decision, and they made one very bizarre challenge, and that was on one of the experts, psychiatric experts, a professor, who the Judge Baretza had relied upon. The problem was that this professor, let me just get his name just escapes me. I'm just looking through go through the judgment of this, the name of this professor. That's what happens is when one gets older. Yeah, Professor Kopelman. Professor Kopelman, who had sorry, let me just get everything. Professor Kopelman, he was the one who had upon whom the judge had relied, who had said that he thought that Assange was suicidal. The problem was that in his initial report, Kopelman had made no mention of the fact that essentially that Julian Assange had a fiancée and two small children with their fiance. He subsequently corrected it, but in his initial report, he made no mention of this, and he made no mention of it because he was trying to protect the security of Assange's fiancée Stella Morris and the two small children, which was perfectly understandable given everything that we found out about CIA assassination plots against Assange. There were clearly attempts to kidnap him and so on, and they may well have been, certainly you wouldn't put it past the security services to put pressure on Julian Assange by kidnapping his fiancée or arresting his fiancée and whatever. So those are very good reasons why Kopelman kept her name out of it. But in a subsequent report a few months later, he mentioned that Julian Assange had a fiancée and two small children. The Americans pounced upon this and said, well, Kopelman had misled the court, and therefore his testimony on Julian Assange's mental state should be discounted. But the implication, the Americans' implication was that somehow, because Julian Assange had a fiancée and two small children, therefore he can't possibly be suicidal. Well, that's of course an absolutely ridiculous idea, because we know that plenty of people commit suicide even though they have small children and all kinds of dependents. If you're suffering from very severe depression, then the fact that you have dependence upon you doesn't stop you from committing suicide. So it's a ridiculous argument that, well, he can't possibly be suicidal if he has a fiancée and two small children. But anyway, this was one of the grounds upon which the Americans launched their appeal. And then another ground was that Judge Baretza had not asked from the Americans, some assurances as to the conditions in which Julian Assange would be held in the United States. So, as I say, the special administrative measures and the supermax prison, and then the issue of whether he can serve out his prison term in his native Australia. So that was the basis of the United States' appeal. The decision that came down yesterday was quite strange, because they had rejected most of the grounds of the Americans' appeal, because even on the question of Kopelman, the court was ruled in a very peculiar way, because they accepted that Kopelman had misled the lower court by not disclosing in his initial report, by not disclosing that Assange had a fiancée and two small children. So they said, he misled the court, and the judge, who basically said, I know he misled the court. However, I accept that he did it in good faith, and I accept that he is a dispassionate, disinterested scientist, and that his decision that not decision, his judgment that Julian Assange is suicidal and would be suicidal if he were placed under the sort of the particular harsh regimen of U.S. prisons. So she said, I accept that this was done in, his decision, or rather his judgment, is sound and based on science, not on personal prejudice. That was her decision. So she said, Kopelman misled the court initially, but he did it for understandable reason. Nonetheless, I accept his judgment that there's a real danger of Julian Assange committing suicide in an American prison. Now, what the High Court said about that was that, yes, Kopelman had misled the court, and the judge shouldn't have accepted that Kopelman acted in good faith. There was no basis for her to think that Kopelman acted in good faith. Kopelman may well have been acting in a prejudicial way and not as a scientist. Nonetheless, the High Court said it was still within her discretion to decide whose judgment she would accept. I mean, if she felt that Kopelman's judgment was sound, then that was within her discretion, and the High Court, although it disagreed with her, because the High Court thought, yeah, that he's not a reliable witness. Nonetheless, the High Court said, yeah, it's within her discretion to accept or reject Kopelman's judgment. So that basis, that the whole of the Americans, which made a big thing out of Kopelman, that was ruled out. That was by the High Court. The other part, which was the assurances that the Americans gave, which was said, no, we're not going to put him into one of those DAX prisons, the one in Colorado, and we're not going to apply these special administrative measures against Julian Assange unless he does something to merit it. In other words, as things stand, we're not going to apply these things against him. But should that change, should he do something dreadful when he's in American custody, then these drastic measures could be applied against him. So, but here, and I think it was it's a measure of what a mess that judgment yesterday was. That the court seemed to get confused about the DAX prison. So they said at one point, they said, oh, well, the Americans said that they're not going to have committed not to send him to a DAX prison pre-trial. Well, that's a meaningless promise, because the DAX prison is not a pre-trial detention center. So if he were to be sent to a DAX prison, that would become after post-trial, post-conviction. So that would be an empty promise. But at other points, the judgment said, oh yeah, the Americans have said that either pre-trial or post-trial, Julian Assange would not be sent to a DAX facility. So I guess, as I say, the judgment was actually confused about this business of whether it's pre-trial or post-trial. But in any case, they said, okay, the Americans made that commitment. The Americans also made the commitment that Julian Assange will have the first-rate psychiatric care available to him when he's in detention. Well, in other words, he's not going to get first-rate. He's not going to get some top-rank psychiatrist, but he will have whatever psychiatric care the prison provides. So that's what he'll have. And should he be convicted, then Julian Assange will have the opportunity to make an application to serve out his prison term in Australia. So keep in mind, the United States did not that he will serve out his prison term in Australia. It just said, well, we will allow him to make an application to serve out his prison term in Australia. So it's again fairly meaningless promise. So it's a fairly meaningless promise to say that we won't apply special administrative measures against him unless he does something to deserve it, and he won't be sent to a supermax facility unless he does something to deserve it. And then you'll have psychiatric care of the kind that's available in the prison. Again, so what? I mean, you would expect anyone in any prison to have available to him or her psychiatric treatment, whatever psychiatric treatment is available in any prison. I mean, no one's saying that it's going to be great psychiatric care. Probably all they do is give you some medication to knock you out, and that's about it. I mean, you doubt whether there's any sophisticated psychiatric care there. And then again, oh yeah, well, he can apply to serve out his term, his prison term in Australia. We won't stand in the way. Doesn't mean that we're actually going to let him go to Australia, because as the prosecutors point out, it's not up to them to make that decision. In any case, it's not even up to them to make a decision about detention. I mean, they can't make any kind of a commitment as to where he will serve out his term, because ultimately the prosecutors can make an extradition request. Once that extradition request is fulfilled, then whatever happens afterwards will be in the hands of the custodial authorities, or in the hands of the judge. I mean, it'll be the judge who'll decide where Julian Assange will serve out his term. So the prosecutors cannot make any such commitment. Just as if he makes an application to serve out his term in Australia, the prosecutors can't make any kind of a commitment. Yeah, he'll be able to go to Australia to serve it out. Now, I don't believe for one moment that the United States, at any level, whether judges, prosecutors, Department of Justice, the president will ever permit Julian Assange to serve out his prison term in Australia. I mean, it just cannot happen, because the Americans do not trust anybody at all when it comes to Julian Assange. They think the moment he's out of U.S. custody, somebody else would just let them go, and the Australians will probably just let him go. So there's no way in the world the Americans would just simply say, okay, that's fine, you can go to Australia and serve out your term. And so none of that is going to happen. None of these American commitments are worth the paper they're written on. I mean, does anyone really think that once he's in U.S. custody, anyone's going to say, well, hey, we made a commitment to the British, we made all sorts of promises to them, that we got to stick to that. We go, our word is our bond. And then, no one can say that we lied and we made a dishonest statement to the British. So that that cannot happen. It's for the judges to say, well, the Americans, we have to take seriously when they make these commitments. If they promise they're going to do these things, then yeah, we have to believe their promise. This from the people who we know. I mean, this was already in the newspapers. I mean, this point has been made by others, by Glenn Greenwald and plenty of other people. But here we know that at the highest level of the U.S. government, there were discussions and serious attempts to assassinate and kidnap Julian Assange. So you then say, these are the people that were ready essentially to murder Julian Assange, abduct him in violation of all laws. They were ready to do this. And now you're going to believe their commitment. Oh, no, we're going to respect his freedom and his personal dignity. We're not going to apply any of these special administrative measures against him. We're not going to send him in isolation. No. We'll be very respectful towards him. It is ludicrous. And what measures do the British have against the Americans? What are they going to do if the Americans break their word? I pretty promise I'm never going to speak to you again. That's it. You're not my friend anymore. It's laughable. It's laughable. I mean, the British accept everything that the Americans throw at them without any recourse at all. I mean, just look at if we just compare the Americans' attitude to British extradition requests with the British attitude to the American extradition. I mean, the British have just been absolutely kowtowing to the Americans right from the start in the case of Julian Assange, going all the way back to 2010 when they rushed to execute that idiotic arrest warrant from Sweden, again, which the Americans were very keen on. So that was in 2010. All this time, They've been basically following the demands of the United States, and compare that with the Americans' attitude towards the killing of Harry Dunn. Remember, Harry Dunn was that young man who was killed by a woman who turned out to be, said to be anyway, the wife of a US diplomat. She was driving on the wrong side of the road and she killed this boy. Well, that's that. So, and then it was a hit and run. She rushed home and got on a plane back to the United States. So it's a hit and run. She was completely at fault. She was driving on the wrong side of the road. A boy was killed. And the British, they went to the Americans and said, hey, can we have this woman, please? Because, everyone was very upset about this. I mean, after all, it's a, young boys being killed, and it was all her fault. And the Americans said, nope, can't do it. Sorry, can't help you. That's it. That's the Americans' attitude. They don't comply with any of these extradition requests. So so it's an entirely one-sided operation. So what are the British going to do? If the Americans break their word about their treatment of Julian Assange. Besides, the Americans aren't going to break their word. They're just going to say, yeah, well, he committed additional crimes. We had to apply these special administrative measures against him because, he did very bad things. We had no choice. If he hadn't behaved very badly, we can always find something that he did which he shouldn't have. We were forced to do so. So it's a meaningless promise. So now the question is, what happens now? In theory, of course, because the High Court, and it was a nasty judgment, because the High Court could have thrown it back to the lower court. Should come back to Judge Baretza and then say, okay, well, now the Americans have made their commitments, which they hadn't beforehand. Why don't you now re-adjudicate this case in light of these commitments from the Americans? And that would have been the reasonable thing to do, because essentially, this ruling yesterday is completely idiotic, because the actual appeal revolved around, it's centered around the issue of Julian Assange's mental state and the oppressive conditions which what it might trigger once he was in American custody. That was what the appeal was about. So for the Americans then not to have issued their commitments at that time when the appeal was taking place, well, tough. That's the way it goes. That's the way the legal system works, and so therefore, for what happens is that you come along, and so then at the appeal they say, well, we didn't know that the judge wouldn't ask us for a commitment. Well, that was it. They knew perfectly well that that was the issue. The issue that was under discussion was the oppressive prison conditions and Julian Assange's mental health. The Americans failed to issue any commitments about how they would treat Julian Assange. And then they turn around and say, well, okay, well, now that the decision has gone against us, we would like to relitigate the case. Well, you can't do that. Everybody knows that the whole point of an appeal is essentially, did the judge misapply the law to the facts of the case? That's all. You can't relitigate a case on appeal. You can't say, well, I wish, now that I know what the judge said, I'd like to amend the statements that I made at trial. So it was a ridiculous appeal to begin with. And then, but at least, if the High Court had been fair about it, if the High Court had been fair about it, at least they could have said, okay, well, now that we have these commitments, Judge Baretza, she can rehear these arguments and see whether she still sticks to the finding that she made in light of these commitments, whether she thinks that it changes anything in any substantial way. But the judge, but yesterday's High Court did not allow her to do that, and on the contrary, it said it sent it back to her with instruction that now you send it to the Justice Minister, the Secretary of Justice or whatever he's called, which is Dominic Raab. In other words, it's now up to the government minister as to whether they're going to execute the extradition warrant. Well, so in other words, no more hearings now. So if that's the case, there's no question that the government minister will indeed execute the extradition warrant. They've already done it. The Home Secretary has already signed off on the extradition. I mean, that happened very early on, as soon as the United States made the extradition application. So there's no question that that's what he'll do. Dominic Raab is, he's a ghastly person. I mean, he's just, we don't need to go into Dominic Raab. Another one of these characters, part of the sort of humanitarian intervention crowd. He was involved with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which I talked about at some length the other day in my live stream. So anyway, I don't expect anything from Dominic Raab. So now, there's, if the Assange team has been given 2 weeks to lodge an application for appeal to the UK Supreme Court. Of course, the UK Supreme Court doesn't have to accept it. If it doesn't accept it, then the government minister signs off on the extradition warrant, and Julian Assange is on a plane to the United States. There really is no other court that that he has any means to, because there is the European Court of Human Rights. The problem is that the European Court of Human Rights really has no means of executing its decision. So I can imagine the European Court of Human Rights would demand that the extradition be stayed, but the UK court does not accept the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights. It just doesn't believe that it's under their jurisdiction. It might, it might decide, but it's entirely a voluntary thing as to whether it accepts the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights. It doesn't have to do so. And so, it's not going to be bound by any ruling from the European Court of Human Rights. So then the question is, what will the UK Supreme Court do? It's always very hard to decide, to guess what judges are going to do. I mean, I tend to think that given that a lower court has ruled one way, the High Court ruled the other way, that the UK Supreme Court will feel an obligation to to break the tie. One rules one way, another rules the other way, and they feel that there's a need for it to step in to decide who's right. Particularly is I think, but I don't know if the UK Supreme Court would agree, that the High Court decision yesterday was just quite ridiculous, amazingly unconvincing. So the UK Supreme Court may want to step in and come in and do a more judicious ruling. No, I'm not saying that it's going to reject the Americans' extradition application, but it may not want the UK High Court's decision yesterday to be the last word on the matter. So I would guess, but for what it's worth, that the UK Supreme Court will take the case. But of course, that doesn't really help Julian Assange very much, because then he remains in Belmarsh, which is a sort of the British version of a supermax prison. Again, outrageous that he should be held in those conditions. And he just these the decisions, they don't, they're not going to happen tomorrow, next week. So it's got, he's going to have to wait a long time for him before the case is heard, and then of course they have to adjudicate and so on. Now, keep in mind that the decision to hold him in Belmarsh is completely outrageous. Again, Julian Assange has not been convicted of anything, so there's absolutely no reason for him to be held in those horrible conditions in Belmarsh. Remember, in the case of Augusto Pinochet, which was back in the late 1990s, when he was arrested for human rights violations, and then again it was a long litigation, went again trial court, high court, then I think it was the House of Lords, I think it was before the Supreme Court instituted. So it went to the House of Lords. So it went on for a while before the House of Lords actually ruled against Pinochet. But during the time in which this was adjudicated, I mean, Pinochet was staying in somebody's home. I mean, I think he was under some kind of rules of confinement, but he lived in fairly pleasant conditions. I mean, lived in, I don't know, I think it was in a country house somewhere. So obviously he couldn't escape or anything like that. But it was fairly pleasant. He wasn't being kept in a prison. Margaret Thatcher went to visit him. So it was not too bad. Now, in the end, the House of Lords did rule against Pinochet, because it was the Spanish judge who had issued the extradition request against Pinochet, and so the House of Lords finally ruled against Pinochet. But then the British government, and that was the Tony Blair's government, stepped in and said, "Oh no, well, Pinochet is in very poor health. We can't really let him go to face trial in Spain," and they allowed Pinochet to fly home to Chile. So that was a whole thing. It went on for, I don't know, 2 years. I can't, maybe longer than 2 years. But in the end, and when the House of Lords ruled against Pinochet, and then it was up to the UK Home Secretary, I think it was Jack Straw, to essentially execute the warrant. Said, yeah, he's in terrible health. He can go back to Chile. But the question is, why does Pinochet enjoy this fairly pleasant existence? Well, relatively pleasant. I mean, obviously he's not free to come and go, but he wasn't held in any supermax prison. But this is what the British have imposed on Julian Assange, and he's now been held in Belmarsh for 2.5 years. The only thing he's been convicted of is bail jumping, which is, again, there were reasons for it, and it's a very minor offense, certainly nothing meriting detention in a supermax prison. So that would be my guess as to what will happen. I think that the UK Supreme Court will accept the case, will accept the appeal. I think that how they'll rule is of course is a different case altogether. The problem, of course, for Julian Assange is that even if the UK Supreme Court rules in his favor, that may not do him any good, because the chief, the attorney who was representing the U.S. government in these extradition hearings, I think his name is Lewis, had said, kind of clearly given an indication that the Americans would just simply renew the extradition request. So even if one extradition request is rejected by the courts, they can reapply. The issue of double jeopardy doesn't apply here. Like, you can keep applying for extradition, forever. and the British, who just were happy enough to comply with all American requests, would just simply comply with the next extradition request. So the only way ultimately this could end is if the UK government just simply said, we're not going to go ahead with this, and just let him go. I mean, just as they made the decision to let Pinochet go, that they're just tired of this whole thing. But if the British government doesn't do that, then even a ruling by the UK Supreme Court in Julian Assange's favor doesn't mean that he will be released from prison, because I think they'll just keep him in custody while the Americans make their next extradition request. So Boyan Perko asks, so what happens once he's in the USA? Secret court, secret evidence, anonymous witnesses, conviction, Guantanamo, daily cavity search, accidental death. Yes, is the answer. I mean, that's what I think is likely to happen. There is a possibility. I mean, if he's in the US, that there's some well-known First Amendment lawyers could step in on his behalf and really publicize this case. I mean, I'm just thinking of somebody like Alan Dershowitz, who I think has been a champion of Julian Assange. I can imagine him taking up his case. If he takes up his case, then some of the things that Boyan you've listed may be a little hard to do. Not impossible. I mean, even if it's Alan Dershowitz, and given his his gift for publicity and so on, even so, the courts will say, no, I mean, this is secret. This is highly classified information. We can't possibly have the public knowing about it. And Dershowitz may complain, but if the courts rule against Dershowitz, there's not much he'll be able to do about it. So there's definitely all of those things could happen. I mean, the stories that one hears about the Eastern District of Virginia, where any trial of Julian Assange would take place, is quite horrific. I mean, they really love secret courts, and denying defendants and attorneys proper access to information. So all of those things could happen. I mean, I'd like to think, be optimistic and think, oh, well, once he's here in the US, and he puts together a team of crack First Amendment lawyers, including Dershowitz, but there'll be others, then maybe he would get somewhere within the US system. You can't always tell in the American system, because even if let's say all that we say about the Eastern District of Virginia, it goes against him, he'll have means of appeal. And then once you get it up to, I'm not sure which circuit the Eastern District of Virginia comes under, but once you get it up to higher courts, you never know. I mean, you might be able to get some decent arguments, but I mean, ultimately, the US government is absolutely determined to shut him down, to shut WikiLeaks down, and to essentially serve a warning on everybody else. Don't ever try this again. Don't ever do this again. And so, because if you do this again, publish information about our war crimes, publish information about the sleazy activities. You do that, we're just going to destroy you. In this case, literally destroy your life. We're going to keep you in custody. We'll throw you into one horrific prison after another. So that's what they want to do. They want to just provide this as a lesson to everyone else. Don't do this. Don't ever try this again. And look, I mean, humans are what they are, and I think this will have the effect that the American government desires, because I think people are going to be frightened. And incidentally, this will apply to anybody anywhere in the world. I mean, it doesn't have to be some American journalist. I mean, let's remember. I mean, Julian Assange is not an American. He's not an American citizen. He's never worked in the United States. He's never worked for a U.S. publication. I don't think he's ever spent very much time in the United States. I think other than a few visits, and yet the Americans went after him, in third, fourth countries. So therefore, this becomes a message to anyone, anywhere, that if you publish things that the U.S. government really doesn't want to see published, the Americans can come after you and say you have violated the Espionage Act, and so. And again, the case against Assange is very, very flimsy, because essentially he is a publisher like any other publisher. I mean, he's a publisher like the New York Times is a publisher, like any newspaper is a publisher. That they all of them publish this information. The only difference that they can cite about WikiLeaks is the claim that Julian Assange encouraged the theft of documents. But there's no evidence for that. There's no evidence. I mean, the evidence that he was engaged in theft of documents, and clearly Chelsea Manning has said no, denied that he was engaged in any theft of documents. But the only evidence is from this Icelandic creepy guy who's a thief and a pedophile. And I mean, he's the one, and he's admitted that he's basically lied in claiming that Julian Assange engaged in the theft of documents. Anyway, Nebin Dog says January the 6th prisoners are held in jail on misdemeanors, no bail. It's not just Assange. They've been beaten and abused by sickos. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, because the people who are now held in custody in that DC jail, now they've been held in custody, and some of them from last January, so it's now almost a year, but some of them since March and so on. But what's really appalling is that they haven't actually been charged with anything. And so we got people being held who haven't been charged. They haven't been convicted of anything. And there's no justification whatsoever for holding people in detention before trial. Now, you could justify it if there's a real risk of flight. They might hop on a plane. I don't know how, because even if you confiscate somebody's passport, I don't quite know how they can get out of the country. But okay, but be that as it may, it's unlikely that any of these people would have the resources to flee to some other country. But the point, or in the case of violence, these are all people who have no history of violence. There's no evidence that they would use their freedom to threaten or intimidate anybody. There's no history of any criminal conduct on their part. So therefore, there is no justification whatsoever for holding them in detention before trial, other than, again, you want to punish people for having the wrong views. That's it. You just want to, their punishment is because they supported Donald Trump and they refused to accept that the election was on the up and up. So it's a matter of wrong think. You think the wrong things, you must therefore be punished. I mean, it is the sort of the classic Orwellian case. You haven't done anything wrong other than you don't accept the truth that everyone demands that you accept. So the truth was that this was the freest, fairest election ever, and that Joe Biden won that election fair and square. I mean, so anybody at all who says, I think that election was a joke, and even if, not just just let's say you don't go as far as Donald Trump or Steve Bannon. Let's just say I think that election was a joke, and I have no idea who won that election. I mean, there was just so many fake and phony ballots floating around that who the hell knows at this stage who really won that election. That wouldn't be good enough. If you were to say that to the judge, that wouldn't be good enough. That wouldn't get you out of jail. So it really is a matter. You have to accept, like Galileo, you have to fall down on your knees and tell them that the Earth does not rotate around the sun. So, but it's the trials have now been, of these January the 6th people, the trials have now been postponed well into next year. So they're going to be held in custody for about 18 months. So, you think about that custody, before trial for 18 months. Well, it's not as though they're facing charges of murder, for which they're facing, so that if they're convicted, they're looking at serious prison time. Whatever they're going to be convicted of, it's not going to be, even if they are convicted. And after all, the whole point of you can't detain people before trial is that you can't anticipate what the court is going to do, because we don't know whether they're going to be convicted. So you can't just simply work on the assumption that the person will be convicted. But in this case, even if they were convicted, that was already be, since the charges aren't that serious, it could well be for time less than the time that they've already been in this horrific prison. So it's an obvious injustice. It's kind of an interesting thing, because here, this is such a manifestly unjust situation in which you're holding people in detention before trial, before they've been convicted of anything. And the charges that they're facing are not, the ones that the media talk about, insurrection, sedition. They're not facing any of these charges. Because if they tried to make that case, the courts would just have to throw them out. I mean, it would be such a ridiculous idea that the guy with the fur outfit, was trying to overthrow the government. So people can repeat these things, and but ultimately none of that happened. None of that was remotely likely to happen. I mean, the worst that happened on January the 6th is that the certification process was delayed by a few hours. That's it. It was delayed by a few hours. But if you're going to try and make that into kind of an insurrection, I mean, it's ludicrous. But nonetheless, it's much of the media serve as kind of a sounding board for the Democratic Party. It is just what are the talking points of the day, and then they say, well, these are the talking points of the day, and so you can go ahead and just repeat them. So the talking points of the day. Oh, there was an insurrection attempt. There was an attempt to overthrow the government, and they stormed the Capitol, inspired by Donald Trump's lies. And then you get the same variation of the same story, whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Hill or whatever. So I say, oh, they were inspired by Donald Trump's lies about the election. But the interesting thing is that the people repeat this, and foreigners, people abroad, they don't really know about this. They say, oh yeah. I mean, look. I lived in the UK, as I lived in the UK for many years, and the coverage of the United States in the British press, it was a joke. I mean, it was ridiculous, and the reason it was a joke, because British journalists did nothing other than regurgitate the stories that they read in the New York Times and the Washington Post. So that, you go, well, I'm the Washington correspondent of the Times, or I'm the New York correspondent of the Daily Telegraph. But they get there, and then what does the New York Times say about this? And then they just do regurgitate and they publish that stuff in there in the Times and the Telegraph. And that's and what's true about the UK is also true in France and Germany. They get their information about what goes on in the United States from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the networks. I came across this first during the coverage of Watergate, and I'll tell you something. I mean, whatever you think about Nixon, the coverage of Watergate was abysmal. I mean, absolutely abysmal, and completely, one-sided and ridiculous and stupid. But that's what happens now. So this story about how Donald Trump lies about the election, and that every court in the land has rejected Donald Trump's claims about the election, complete bunk. But they repeat this. Because, of course, as observers, honest observers would note that the election, the claims that that there was fraud in the election were not actually heard by any of the courts, and most of the applications were not made by Donald Trump. There were people acting on behalf of Donald Trump, but they were made by Donald Trump, and the courts simply didn't listen. They wouldn't hear these appeals about that election. So you can't say, well, the courts rejected them. They didn't reject them. I mean, they just didn't. They didn't listen to them. So but nonetheless, the media keep regurgitating it. Yesterday, I took part in a discussion. It was on TRT, which is a Turkish television station, and there were, I think it was 3 people, and it was about the democracy summit, and I absolutely knew going in there was going to be somebody on the panel who was going to make a point of citing as an example of American hypocrisy. Whoa, what about January the 6th? Whoa, January the 6th. And they say, well, that, so, and they think they're being kind of progressive, liberal and progressive. I say, whoa, January the 6th, we had an insurrection which was led by Donald Trump, who, was lying to the American public and making false claims and so on. And this was spouted forward by a guy called Matthew Brija, I think that's how you pronounce it. He's actually an American diplomat of long standing, so he's been around for a long time. And as American diplomats go, they're kind of quite often quite charming. Doesn't mean that what they do is charming. He seems a charming person. But what was interesting is that he came up with all of these the stories as to show America shouldn't really be in the business of lecturing anybody. So it seems like, a good progressive liberal point of view. Yes, America shouldn't lecture anyone because, why? Because, we have the January the 6th, the riot, the insurrection, and Donald Trump leading it. Well, I think obviously the United States shouldn't be lecturing anyone, but I can think of a hell of a lot better arguments than that, because if you're going to make the issue that we have a president who refuses to accept an election result, then let's go back 2016, and we had another president who refused to accept an election result, Barack Obama. Barack Obama refused to accept the election result, launched that phony Russiagate hoax of an investigation, made a claim without any evidence at all that Russia intervened in the US election, and that this intervention was made a significant difference. In other words, that Trump somehow secured the election because of Russian help. He had no evidence for any of that, but nonetheless, it was Obama who launched that investigation, and the country was bogged down this whole Russiagate hoax. So now, only now, which is 2016. So now, 5 years later, we're beginning to get to the truth of what really happened in 2015, 2016, in terms of Russiagate, how the hoax was conceived, who pushed it, and so on. It's going to take some time. The exact role played by Barack Obama, I don't know if we'll ever find out, but all these things we'll get to. So all talk about Trump and the courts. Oh, the courts have all rejected Trump's claims. As I said, the courts haven't, but there's still time. It's only been a year. Gradually we will learn more and more about the election. Anyway, we have a super chat from our friend Spectre in the Air, who says, sorry I'm late, I ran another 5,000 with my daughter. It's very impressive, and that's I don't know where you're located, but it's pretty cold today. So anyway, well, cold here in Hungary, but I don't know. So if she beat me by 20 seconds. That's very impressive. I don't know how old your daughter is, but that's pretty impressive to beat you by 20 seconds. 20 seconds is a lot in a race. So anyway, media are part of the Democratic Party machine. Journalists parrot one another. That's I think the problem. I think that so much of the media are involved in regurgitating Democratic Party talking points. I mean, I know I say this all the time, but it's like it's kind of Democratic Party bulletin board. So what's the Democratic Party position? Well, Biden is doing a bloody good job. If he's not doing well in the polls, then it's a problem with communication, or it's the Trump, or the mean Republicans, or Fox News, or whatever. You can always blame it on someone else. It's inherent, it's in the psyche of many journalists. I read the other day, was an article in Politico, and it was about Steve Bannon and the indictment of Steve Bannon, and that the trial of Bannon has now been delayed to, I think, next June or July. Anyway, of course, the reporter of Politico is completely, spluttering with indignation that it's going to be delayed in June or July. Again, no one has any indignation by the fact that the January 6th people is going to be, so that goes back to January the 6th, but the fact that their trials are not going to take place till next June or July, they don't care about that. Good, let them rot in prison. But they're upset that Steve Bannon, whose trial won't be till June or July, because they want it as soon as possible, because otherwise there won't be enough time for the Democrats to pivot to the bread and butter issues, in which the Democrats usually do very well, before the midterms. So they might not do well in the midterms because they won't have time to pivot to the bread and butter issues that are the traditional strong point for Democrats. Well, I mean, if bread and butter issues were somehow the strong points in the Democrats, then why is Biden doing so poorly in the polls? I mean, the guy's passed two big budget bills. I mean, he passed the one big infrastructure bill, plus in other words, one of those big COVID handouts, several $1 trillion. But it doesn't seem like it's the public is much impressed with that. So the whole idea that, oh, well, it's bread and butter issue, and people think, oh, Democrats, they're really good on bread and butter issues. Well, you've got an inflation rate, which is quite shocking. It's the highest in 40 years. Something people know about. Something, you tell people the trade deficit is in a dire state. Most people couldn't care less. You know, what is a trade deficit? They don't understand. You tell them that oh, the stock market is not doing well. Well, I mean, unless you actually got any investments in the stock market, doesn't make any difference to you. But when it's inflation, then people know. You know, it's the most basic thing that you can identify, which is, gee, you know, that hamburger meat, raw raw meat for hamburger, it cost me such and such a couple of months ago, and now it's a lot more expensive. And people recognize that's the most basic thing that you can always notice, that something that cost me, you know, X amount a month ago now is a hell of a lot more than X. So, you know, don't have to be a genius. You don't have to understand the higher points of economics to understand that. Anyway, you know, Spectre in the air is another super chat. Thank you so much, Spectre. Says, because in answer to my question, your daughter is 18. You tell me your age, but I'll be discreet and I won't tell people what your age is. But you live in the northeast coast of the US, and then it says the media disconnect from us. Inflation is 6.9%. Yeah, that's right. And then you say, which is probably low ball. No question, it is low ball. And then you finally say Bannon has them where he wants them. You know, it's very, very interesting when you bring up Bannon, because you know, right now there are articles regularly appearing in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times. They're very concerned about the sudden surge of activism among Republicans, you know, they at every level, whether it's these school board meetings, you know, at precinct levels, county levels, you know, everyone's sort of running for office, or, you know, want to hold some sort of a position, you know, at the next election. They want to be election observers, and they've never seen anything like this, and there's absolute panic about this, and there's no question that this is being driven by Bannon. I mean, Bannon's show, which is called the War Room, it has a huge following. I mean, he has his team around him. He has Peter Navarro, and you know, and he has various sidekicks. But what Bannon has done is he has emphasized activism. He hasn't said, okay, let's complain about the media. Let's complain about Mitch McConnell or Kevin McCarthy, or you know, let's complain about the election or whatever. I mean, that he never does that. He says, no, you know, he has this thing of action. I mean, that he keeps saying this all the time. And that's what he does. He has this show, and he has these various sidekicks come on, and the theme is always, what do you need to do to make your voice heard? You know, what position? You know, you got, boom, you want to be work in the precinct, right? You know, get a position in the precinct, go to the next school board meeting, sign up to be an election observer, run for a council position, on a county board for something, whatever it is, no matter how low level, how, unglamorous, make your voice heard. And there is absolute panic. There's no question. I mean, there was the articles appearing on, I listed some of the newspaper, but it's everywhere. It's NPR, by this sudden surge of activism, because this activism usually been associated with the left. The left was always been very clever. You go to the meetings, most people are too lazy to show up. Now, understandably, I mean, who wants to go out to a kind of a dreary meeting on a cold night when you could stay at home and and watch Netflix? But the left was always very good at you show up, you make your voice heard, so it's now suddenly, Bannon has created this army. What's it? Yeah, is it the posse army? I think and that's why there's a lot of concern everywhere. I mean, there's a great deal of concern in any case about the midterms, but now it's going to be difficult, to run an election that they ran last November. It's never going to happen again. I mean, even though, there'll be COVID restrictions and they're going to try and pull the whole thing about early voting and, and even having these drop boxes and so on. And there was no question they will still try to do all the things that marred the last election. We can't possibly have in-person voting. The COVID, it just prevents any of that. And it's going to be hard to insist upon maintaining in-person voting. But with so many election observers around, it's probably going to be just difficult to pull any scams. I mean, I think there'll be observers everywhere. You just can't, and if anyone tries to keep observers out, there'll be a whole bunch of other observers, and filming everything. So it's going to be a different election. The midterms are going to be a very different from the from last November. Even if it's going to, it doesn't look like we can get out of this whole rut of COVID restrictions. So anyway, there's another super chat from Detroit Rock City. It's a friend of ours. Thank you so much, Detroit. And so it says, thank you for a great program. Thank you so much. It's very nice of you. So we have Mad Mike says, Democrats are now the party of the rich, the deep state, social media monopoly, anti-free speech, pro-military industrial complex, pro-segregation, etc. Yeah, I think that's very true. They're in all of those things, and I think that it's an amazing transformation that's taken place. Really, it started sometime, I guess, in the during the Obama years. So if you go back to say 2008, you think, okay, the Democrats seem to have the stronger arguments because you have the Democrats that the war, the Iraq invasion was George W. Bush. I mean, yes, the Democrats endorsed the war. And Hillary Clinton and Biden and all the rest of them, they all voted for that war. But it was still George W. Bush's war. You can't, he owns it. Bush, Cheney, Powell, and the rest of them, it was their war. And then, of course, you had the economic collapse of 2008. And again, you can say, well, there were other people that were to blame. It wasn't just George W. Bush. Look at the whole basically policy of giving out free loans to people who had no hope whatsoever of repaying these loans, these mortgages. That was the that I can't remember the name of the community redevelopment legislation of the 1990s. It was all about, we need to have as many homeowners as possible. So basically the banks were just handing out mortgages, and they knew that these people were never going to pay them back. So, hence the housing bubble. And of course, it was just a matter of time before it would just burst. I mean, that's what happens with bubbles. So, you artificially stimulate an economy, and then finally, when the bills come due, there is a complete collapse. And it was, as I say, it was bipartisan. It started under Clinton, but it continued under George W. Bush. So, but Bush was president. Bush gets the blame for it. And so, when Obama came along in 2008, well, we say, hey, this is, the Democrats thoroughly deserve this victory, because the Bush-Cheney years were just so awful that, Bush, it's good to have a party of the left that's going to clean up the place, clean up the military-industrial complex, clean up Wall Street, clean up all this, essentially, what was basically socialism for the rich, capitalism for everyone else. So, but that's not what happened under Obama. It was a bailout for the banks, no bailout for individual homeowners. But then when Trump came along, suddenly the Democrats, they abandoned this position, somehow on the left, and aligned themselves with the national security state, because the national security state was in absolute panic about Trump. And they've just made common cause with the Democrats, who just, that, hey, Trump's making all these noises about rethinking all of these military commitments, rethinking our, kind of ongoing neo-Cold War with Russia, rethinking the policy towards China, whereby, China was pretty much allowed to clean America's clock. And the national security state just, boom, they wanted Trump gone. You're not supposed to call into question or all of the sacraments, or the NATO and the rest, and that's it. And they came up, the national security state, in alliance with the Democrats, cooked up this absolute fraudulent, malevolent, disastrous thing called Russiagate. And they, the whole idea that Russia stole the election and installed Donald Trump. Why? Because Donald Trump was advocating policies that Putin allegedly wants. So therefore, that must prove that Putin is really behind Donald Trump, and he's running Donald Trump. And they ran with this, and the social media companies were happy to go along with it. I actually think that the Democrats really showed themselves to be truly monstrous, because this stuff of claiming that a president is somehow a tool of the Kremlin, that's dangerous stuff. That's very, very serious stuff. I mean, it's serious, first of all, because it's likely to cause possibly a civil war in the country. I mean, you're basically saying that half the country, the half that voted for Trump, is really treasonous and and working for the enemy of the United States. And what you're doing there is essentially triggering a possible war with Russia, and which still could happen. I mean, what's going on now is with Russia, with what we had this week with Biden, is still an after effect of Russiagate. I mean, we're being driven on into this crazy Russophobia, this crazy desire to get into some sort of a shooting war with Russia. I think it's still a consequence of Russiagate. Anyway, let me address some of the super chats which have come in. Very nice of you, thank you. So first of all, Spectre says that Bannon tapped into the raw nerve with us, tired of being called deplorable white supremacists, and then Mitch McConnell is catering to the DC crowd as opposed to the populists. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Mitch McConnell clearly is a corporatist. I mean, that his entire raison d'etre is to keep the lobbyists happy, to raise money from all the corporate contributors. He has no interest at all in the sorts of issues that ordinary people are concerned with. Like ordinary people, I mean, they're concerned with the size of their pay packets. They're concerned about losing their jobs to China, which obviously McConnell, with his extensive Chinese connections, particularly through his wife, who's the daughter of a very rich Chinese person. So McConnell has no interest in any of those issues. With again, closing the border, none of it. All he cares about is money coming into the Republican Party coffers, and obviously enriching himself. And I guess, I mean, why is he leader of the Senate Republicans? I assume it's because he's very good at raising money. He raises money for Republican Senate candidates, and they like it. But he doesn't in any way pursue the kind of policies that Republican voters, the ordinary voters who don't have a lot of money in their pockets, the ordinary voters who have difficulty making rent at the end, at the start of the month, and who feel inflation, McConnell has nothing to say to them. And so the Republican Party has been in this odd position that there's an opening there for a kind of middle class, working class, blue collar, populist kind of administration, because these people are not socialists. I mean, whether they should or shouldn't be, there's a different issue. But ultimately, in America, working class people, they may hate the corporations, they may hate the bosses, but they're not going to embrace a socialist program. I mean, that's just not who they are. But they will embrace a kind of a populist program, which is conservative social values, plus getting tough with greedy, selfish corporations who are ready to screw over working people. And there's an opening there. And Trump, in 2016 saw the opening. What happened then? He kind of lost the thread of the narrative while he was in office. It remains to be seen whether he now understands it. I mean, Bannon understands it. And Bannon, in many ways, is more of a populist than Trump himself. I mean, I think Bannon would be a very good demagogue. I mean, Trump, oddly enough, is not that good as a demagogue. I think Bannon is, and I think that's why Bannon is just banging his drum of this a kind of economic populism. I think another question I think is on China, where I think he takes things too far, and I think I think he's going down a kind of a rabbit hole, because then there's no point in launching yet another Cold War against China, because then we're just going to go back to square one. Yet another NATO, yet another constant military alliances, again risk of stupid interventions everywhere, because we must prevent Chinese intervention or China becoming a great power. So there is a danger that he's going to go down this path, and I think that so if he just sticks to the fact that US has economic interests that are in conflict with the economic interests of China, I think that's a very reasonable point. And I think US has certain grievances, reasonable grievances against China, especially on the issue of COVID. I mean, I've talked a lot about that, but China badly, let the world down, to say the least, on COVID. And it's an absolute international disgrace, the Chinese behavior on COVID. But if you go down this policy of recreating the whole Cold War apparatus against China, I think that's a foolish move. And I think, unfortunately, Bannon and Navarro seem to be heading in that direction. So I've got another, another super chat. So again, Detroit, thank you so much, Detroit. There's Detroit Rock City. It says, is the US stumbling into 3 imminent conflicts, Russia, China, and Iran? What's behind the logic of having all your enemies unite against a common threat? Well, yeah, I think it is very bizarre, because normally, one's attitude is, if you're getting into a conflict with a superpower, you better end some ongoing conflict with another superpower and make nice with that other superpower, and then present your new rival with a united front, 2 against 1, and thereby you avoid getting into a shooting war. Not a great idea to start a conflict when you haven't finished one conflict. I mean, it was always said about Hitler was his disastrous policy of invading the Soviet Union when he hasn't even finished one conflict. I mean, he defeated France, but his war with England still hasn't been settled. I mean, so he's still got that going, and then he launches a war against the Soviet Union. So now he's got two enemies that he needs to deal with. And then, of course, after Pearl Harbor, when Hitler declared war on the United States, now we had three enemies. So it's generally a very, very bad policy to have more than one enemy. You focus on one enemy, don't get yourself at two enemies. No, but it's absolutely true that what we have now is the United States in a conflict with Russia, China, and Iran, which doesn't seem to be a very wise move. Now, the realpolitik, to the extent that there are any serious realpolitik types in the United States today, the realpolitik say, oh, well, we need to peel away Russia from China. Russia is the weaker of the two. And if we can have an alliance with Russia, then at least we have the strength to confront China. I mean, the logic makes sense. I mean, it's kind of what I've been saying. The problem is that ship has sailed. I mean, it's like Russia's not going to trust anything that the United States says. They're not going to abandon their de facto alliance with China, for empty promises from the United States. I mean, they already know about these promises, and the United States made all sorts of promises. They made the promises to Gorbachev in 1989. They made promises in the 1990s with the Partnership for Peace would just simply be a peaceful thing. When we're not looking for NATO membership and so on, and then and then so on, and then we weren't going to. We had the NATO-Russia Foundation Agreement in 1997. We weren't going to move our missiles and our heavy weaponry eastward and so on. All these things have been broken. The United States walked away from the ABM treaty, walked away from the INF treaty. I mean, Russia's just not going to buy into it. I mean, they're not Russians, not stupid people. They're not going to say, hey, let's abandon our alliance with China, which is kind of what has given Russia this the weight that it has today, because when you address Russia, you're basically addressing Russia and China together. So let's abandon that in favor of empty promises that we know they're going to go back on. Within 5 years they're going to go back on any promises they make. So it's just not going to happen. I mean, and the realpolitik types who peddle this as if somehow this is a serious thing, we will peel Russia away from China, and then we'll have Russia on our side confronting China. It is just laughable. I mean, it's like all these people who keep saying. I think Hillary Clinton said this some conference she had attended recently. Just something like, well, the Russians don't fully realize what a threat China is to them, and so keep telling the Russians, well, don't trust the Chinese. They don't mean well by you. You come over to our side. You don't want to become China's junior partner. I mean, it's like when you've lost somebody's trust, then you're not going to get it back. I mean, and the West made very serious mistakes. There were plenty of people who were warning the West that this is going to be a disaster. Essentially, mobilizing against Russia and the West, the United States, NATO, whatever. They went ahead and they pursued their policy, even though it was clear that it would end very, very badly. And it's an ongoing thing. I mean, after all that we have learned about the how foolish this expansion of NATO was, after all of that, and after we've seen what happened in Ukraine in 2014 when the coup, the overthrow of the legitimate government led to the loss of Crimea, Russia really incorporating Crimea, which Russia didn't want to do until the West forced its hand. After the breaking out of the war in the Donbass, after all of that, the West is still trying to egg on Ukraine into a conflict with Russia. And you have the clear warnings that come regularly from Putin and Lavrov, who say this is a red line for us. We're not going to tolerate indefinitely kind of NATO expansion into Ukraine, Ukraine becoming a de facto member of NATO. So we see this, they say, we are watching this, that you keep pouring in military hardware into Ukraine. You keep pouring, you're sending missiles there, drones into Ukraine. And, sooner or later, this is going to end badly, because we're just not going to allow essentially Ukraine becoming an aircraft carrier, just an aircraft carrier facing us, kind of, basically kind of one giant American military installation on our borders. And yet America's continuing with this. So it goes on, and then you have Biden, and then we have the Chinese part of it, which is you've raised Taiwan as an issue. Why would anyone want to raise Taiwan as an issue? I mean, talk about let sleeping dogs lie. I mean, just leave that alone. I mean, there's peace there. It's a very complex issue about Taiwan, but if it's not on the front burner, if the Chinese aren't planning on taking over Taiwan, they don't seem to be interested in using force against Taiwan, then let it, let's leave that for another day. But instead, Americans have now brought this up, and you have Biden, who I think 3 times has said that we have some sort of a commitment to Taiwan. I mean, this is, amazing foolishness. And instead of raising the issue that should be raised, which was COVID, because COVID is something that affects the United States, affects the rest of the world, talking about something that has nothing to do with the rest of the world, which was Taiwan. I mean, that's just, again, folly. So we have another super chat from Spectre. Thank you so much, Spectre. So we need another Church commission. So you're referring to the late Senator Frank Church, who had the famous hearings on the CIA in the 1970s, and then published a very extensive report about the activities of the CIA. In fact, the report, which is very, very interesting, but it probably went a little bit soft on it, because Church was still kind of a part of the political establishment, so he didn't want to go too far. So even on the assassinations, he said, well, I mean, we don't know definitively whether these political leaders were assassinated by the United States. Anyway, so we need another Church commission. Intelligence agencies need to be fixed in. We need to rethink NATO, useful in 1950, not now. Also CCP's biggest threat to the US. Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think we do need another Church commission. These agencies, the CIA, FBI, have become extraordinarily powerful. And they're doing now something that they really were never supposed to do, which was, they're intervening in domestic politics. I mean, so we really can't have intelligence agencies getting involved in domestic politics. And they quite clearly did this in the 2016 election and in the aftermath. And then the whole idea that, oh, well, we were investigating Russian intervention. No, I mean, it was a complete nonsense. It was, you had no basis whatsoever for believing that there was any serious Russian intervention, which is why the FBI misled the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court when they applied for that warrant, that FISA warrant against Carter Page, and they did it on the basis of lies. They had no first-hand information that Carter Page was an agent of the Russians. In fact, it was the other way around. That they had actually doctored the documents, falsified documents that showed clearly that Page had actually worked for the U.S. government. In other words, they deliberately, they misled the FISA court, they misled the public in order to get this FISA warrant, in order to spy on Carter Page. But of course, it was in order to spy on Donald Trump. And this was all being done at the very time when the Obama administration was launching all of the various law enforcement actions, we say, against various people on the Donald Trump's campaign, particularly Michael Flynn, and so when in the case of Flynn, let's go back on that. They launched this investigation of Flynn early in 2016 on this absolutely fraudulent, nonsensical basis that he had some sort of a romantic liaison with a Russian agent. And they identified this Russian agent as this Russian academic. I think her name is Svetlana Lohova. And the basis, because of this creature, Stefan Halper, who was basically an agent of the U.S. government, had claimed that at this dinner, Flynn went home with Svetlana Lohova. Of course, it was all lies. I think Halper wasn't even at this dinner. Flynn did not go home with her. There was no romantic liaison with her. And as far as we know, because that's what Lohova says, she's just an academic. She has no connections with Russian intelligence. But they used this for months and months and months to keep this investigation of Flynn going until finally it was already in the early January, and they had nothing. They basically, you had the FBI people saying, look, we have to close this investigation down. We found nothing on Flynn. There's no evidence whatsoever that Flynn's working for the Russians. And then Obama, Biden, Comey, and the rest cooked up this nonsense that Flynn was violating the Logan Act, because he had been having a conversation, as he should, with as the incoming national security advisor. He had a conversation with the current Russian ambassador, who was the ambassador at the time, Kislyak. And so, Logan Act, that's it. He's a private citizen. He's conducting his own personal foreign policy. Absolute nonsense. I mean, he wasn't a private citizen. He was going to take over as a national security advisor to the president of the United States within about 2 weeks. And that's what you're supposed to do, because the conversation that he had pertained to basically Obama, who had imposed sanctions on Russia and had expelled Russian diplomats, and had also seized Russian diplomatic compounds. So, he has this conversation with Kislyak, and what he says to Kislyak was, don't overreact. If you want to respond, just respond symmetrically. Don't overdo it. Again, exactly what a responsible political figure, policymaker would say. Don't overreact, and just respond proportionately. Then the Russians, in an act of good faith, said, all right, well, we have an incoming administration. It's an incoming administration that has said publicly that they want to work with us, they want to improve relations. And so, in the spirit of Christmas, this was after the Western Christmas, but just before the Eastern Christmas. In the spirit of Christmas, we will not retaliate. On the contrary, we will invite the American diplomats in Moscow and their families to the Christmas celebrations in the Kremlin. It was a very generous, what you do is in a magnanimous gesture. So what did the Obama administration do? They said, oh, hey, they didn't retaliate. We expected them to retaliate. What does that mean? That means that there's some sort of a plot, conspiracy between the Trump people and Putin, because otherwise they would have retaliated. So this magnanimous gesture by the Russians was interpreted by Obama as as proof positive that there was a conspiracy between Putin and Trump, and therefore, well, we really need to get cracking with our investigations. And then, of course, again, when this whole, the issue of the Logan Act came up, they realized, well, this is going to be, we're going to make absolute fools of ourselves if we try to prosecute Flynn on the Logan Act. So what do? They have Peter Strzok and the other guy essentially try to make out that Flynn had lied to them in the when they came to interview him, and making sure that there'd be no lawyer present during the interview. But they essentially, the lie came from the FBI, because the question that they asked, which was that, did you discuss sanctions with Kislyak? To which Flynn said, no, I didn't. And then the FBI deliberately misinterpreted that as saying, oh, well, he lied, because of course he did discuss sanctions with Kislyak. But Flynn was telling the truth. He didn't discuss sanctions with Kislyak. He had discussed the issue of the diplomatic expulsions, because that was those were two separate issues. I mean, Obama had expelled the diplomats and he imposed sanctions. The only issue that he had discussed with Kislyak was the expulsion of the diplomats, and that's when he told Kislyak, as I said, hey, don't overreact. It's a new administration coming in. We're going to rethink all of our policies. So, let's try and keep things on an even keel. But the sanctions issue didn't come up, and so Flynn, when he was interviewed by that creep Peter Strzok, said, hey, we didn't discuss sanctions. And then, of course, they said, oh, no, it was a lie. It was a lying. And then that horrible creature, was the name escapes me. It was the number 3 in the Department of Justice, who was a holdover from the Obama administration, and then pointedly refused to implement the Trump administration's immigration policy, the so-called Muslim ban, for which she was then fired. Is it April? Oh God, I don't know. Maybe somebody can remember her name. Anyway, then she rushed over to the White House to say, "Oh well, Flynn was a liar. He was, and because he's lying, now Putin will have something to hold over the United States, because Putin knows that that he's lying." Sally Yates, thank you, Dexter Berry says Sally Yates. Yes, that's the one, Sally Yates. She rushed over to the White House and said, "Oh God, this is terrible. He's lying, and you have to get rid of Michael Flynn right away, because he's otherwise it was blackmail." So her presentation was very confusing, and no one in the White House actually understood what the hell Sally Yates was talking about. Was the problem that he had violated the Logan Act, or was the problem that that he had lied to Michael Pence, or was the problem that he was lying and Putin would have something to hold over the United States? So it was a lot of confusion. And Yates probably isn't the brightest bulb in the world. Probably she herself was confused. She just wanted Flynn out, just as Obama wanted Flynn out. So she was just, going from one thing to another to suggest why Flynn needs to be fired. Unfortunately, Trump fell for it, and he did fire Flynn. And I think that he never really recovered from it. I mean, his foreign policy in particular never recovered from it, and he stumbled from one fiasco after another over Russiagate. So, anyway, kind of another super chat from Dr. Lin. Thank you so much, Dr. Lin. And then I think a message, super chat question not attached to donation. Well, if you put in a question in the chat box, then I'll try and answer it, Dr. Lin. So, but anyway, thank you so much for your contribution. And then we have something from Darren Levy. Thank you so much, Darren. Is that the neocons have had a hard-on for Putin for a long time now. They will have heartbroken when he decides to retire. Yeah, that's a very good observation. I think Putin almost from the start, and it wasn't really apparent immediately. I mean, to me it was apparent, but I think that Putin's a very cautious person, but it was clear from the moment that he took over in 1999 that Russian policy would change, that the Yeltsin policy of trying to keep in with the United States, of essentially turning Russia over to control by the United States, was now coming to an end. And I think particularly it was the Yugoslavia bombing that triggered the downfall of Yeltsin, because suddenly the Russian leadership, their deep state, the intelligence, military, security apparat, realized just how weak Russia had become. I mean, this was Yugoslavia, the Serbs, and I've often said this, I mean, the Russians regard the Serbs as their little brother. The Russians have always felt that they were the protectors of the Christians in the Balkans, whether it's the Bulgarian Christians or the Serbs. So there's a little brother, and the Christians also in the Middle East. I mean, they've always, saw as their role to be the protectors of the Christians in the Middle East and in the Balkans, and because these Christians shared their Eastern Orthodox faith, they weren't Catholics, so that's why they regard them as their little brother that you're supposed to protect. And when NATO bombed Yugoslavia and Russia was unable to do anything about it, I mean, yes, you had the whole thing with Primakov, who was flying on a plane to the United States, and then the plane turned back. Yes, he turned the plane back, but what the hell was Primakov doing flying to the bloody United States? I mean, he had to have known what was on the cards. I knew what was on the cards. I mean, it was obvious for the past 2 weeks what was on the cards. I mean, NATO was making no secret of its intent to bomb Yugoslavia. So I don't know what the hell Primakov was doing flying to the United States. But, I mean, I don't know why the Russians celebrate Primakov. Oh, what a great man. I see nothing great about him at all. So, But anyway, so there was the Russians were unable to do anything about that bombing. And so this went on 77 days. I mean, this was an 11-week bombing campaign. And all the Russians could do was to fume and rant and shake their fist, but nothing whatever could be done. And to add insult to injury, when the Russians at least tried to provide some sort of humanitarian aid to Yugoslavia, none of the NATO powers would allow them to fly over their airspace. So we're talking about, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and they said, no, you can't fly over our airspace to help the Serbs. And then even, to do it by ship, they would have had to make use of the port of Montenegro, because Serbia doesn't have any outlet to the sea. So their only outlet to the sea was through Montenegro, but Montenegro was, run by that creature Djukanovic, and Djukanovic said, no, we can't. We're not going to allow Russian ships to land here and provide any aid to the Serbs. Anyway, it just showed how weak Russia had become and how much the geopolitical forces had now really tilted against Russia. And again, you have to wonder why it took the Russians so long to realize this. It was fairly obvious, already by 1995, 1996, that Russia had become really weak. And anyway, but this was the aftermath after that horrific debacle, and how Russia was shown to be, basically a completely ineffectual, ridiculous power. I mean, in 1914, Russia had gone to war on behalf of Serbia. Admittedly, it was a disastrous decision, because while Russia was going to war on behalf of Serbia against Austria-Hungary, and Russia could, Russia was strong enough to defeat Austria-Hungary, but behind Austria-Hungary was still Germany, and so if Russia goes to war against Austria-Hungary, effectively Russia was going to war against Germany, and Russia was definitely not strong enough to take on Germany, and it led to obviously complete catastrophe for Russia, military defeat, and then of course the rule by the Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So, but anyway, so shows it's not always a great idea to go to war, even on behalf of little brother. But nonetheless, there it was. That was in 1914. Russia did this noble thing, and now 85 years later, Russia is just too weak to do anything for the Serbs. So that led to the downfall of Yeltsin, and the appointment of Putin initially as prime minister, but then he became president, and then he was appointed president. Yeltsin just retired, so and Putin became president, and then they had an election, and then which Putin won decisively, and so on. But it was clear almost from the beginning that Russia was turning the page, that things were going to be very different under Putin. But Putin's a very cautious person. He doesn't, he's not going to start making big speeches from the start and saying, "Hey, the era of Russia groveling are over. Russia's going to stand up for itself, and we're not on our knees anymore." He talks like that now, but at the time he didn't. And at the time he was quite friendly and welcoming and accommodating to the West, the NATO powers, and maybe he used to visit Crawford, Texas. He used to be quite friendly with George W. Bush. He'd come to the United States and be very, very polite, very friendly with the Bush administration, even after the Bush administration had walked away from the ABM treaty, which now Putin invariably brings up as the clear indication of the sort of the bad faith that the Americans have had demonstrated in their relations with Russia. So even after the US walked away from the ABM treaty, as reward for Russia immediately coming to the United States' assistance after 9/11. After 9/11, basically, Russia said, "Hey, you want to send your forces and your infrastructure and reinforcements, you can use Russian territory to do so." So even after that, when Bush ungratefully withdrew from the ABM treaty, Putin was still friendly with the United States. As I say, he visited George W. Bush, and they used to have, you can still see on YouTube their friendly dinners that they had together and so on. So, but there's no question. And then when he made his Munich speech, Putin, I think it was in 2007, and then you could already see that there was a very different tone that he was now striking. Not hostile. I mean, people talk about how Putin hates the West and so on and so on. He wants to restore the Soviet Union, but because the tone that Putin used in that Munich speech, the Munich Security Conference, was nothing comparable to the tone U.S. policymakers regularly deploy against Russia. But what he said was clearly that the world in which you are just going to assert your dominance and everyone has to jump to it, that era is gone. It's just this is a multipolar era. That unipolar moment the glorious days of the 1990s is gone, and it's clearly warning that Russia will not any longer just simply kowtow to the United States. But that Munich speech clearly was a turning point in the United States' attitude toward Russia. I think they really suddenly realized that, boy, the Yeltsin era really has come to an end, because up until then, they've been so complacent about how weak Russia was. They had this Gorbachev, who kind of tossed away the Soviet Union in return for nothing, tossed away the Warsaw Pact in return for nothing. So Americans weren't very impressed by anyone who did that. And then they had Yeltsin, who was just simply ready to hand over the country. You just give him enough money to do it. I mean, just how much do you want? You can have the whole of Russia. So that, Americans got very complacent during that time. They thought they could get away with anything. I mean, that's why they invaded Iraq. That's why they invaded Afghanistan. That's why they bombed Yugoslavia. They can just do anything. I mean, no one can stop us. But after the Munich speech, I think they realized that we're in a different world. And so you're absolutely right, Darren. So the neocons have had a hard on for Putin for a long time now, and that's exactly right. So that this now what's their policy now? Well, the policy now is to wait out Putin. They think, well, Putin can't go on forever. He's now, I think, 68, 69. So they will have the next elections, and then after that, he will be he's been in his mid to 70s. So he's obviously fit, and obviously healthy and strong, but no one goes on forever. Old age catches up with everyone. So the Americans are waiting it out, and it's not on a. I mean, Russia has often made very drastic changes in policy depending on who's the person in charge. We had this sort of with Lenin, then we had the sort of the fight for power that after Lenin, and then we had Stalin, and Stalin pursued, we know the policies that Stalin pursued, and then the assumption on the part of the West was, after Stalin's death, that whoever comes after Stalin would be very much like Stalin. I mean, if somebody kind of pursue his ruthlessness and brutality, but it'd be maybe even worse, because he'll be a kind of a younger, more vigorous person. But instead, there was a drastic change in policy following the death of Stalin, and the Soviet system. I mean, while the Stalin's Soviet system continued, the foreign policy became much more accommodating, at least for a while, and towards the West. But domestically, also, it was a much more, for want of a better word, a more liberal, more tolerant place. I mean, the terror came to an end. I mean, that was the Soviet system continued, but the Stalinist terror came to an end with Stalin's death. And for a while, it seemed like things were more friendly between the United States and the Soviet Union. We had the meetings with when Khrushchev visited the United States, and we had the Camp David, the spirit of Camp David, and we had Eisenhower and Khrushchev, very friendly. But then it all went very sour with after the shoot down of the U-2 spy plane, and which Khrushchev was absolutely livid about, and then the breakup of the nuclear disarmament conference in Paris in 1960, and then you had again series of very acute crises. And obviously we had the building of the Berlin Wall, we had the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so for a few years, things were very, very tense between the US and the Soviet Union, which again was a change from the spirit of Camp David, which was 1959. But then after Khrushchev's departure, we were in for a new era of détente that took place in the 70s, and then that came to an end. So it's not wholly unreasonable for American policymakers just to say, all right, let's wait out Putin, and maybe, just maybe, we'll get a leader who will be, more accommodating, more pro-Western than Putin is. You never know. You really never know, because after all, Medvedev, who there are all sorts of views about Medvedev. There are people just in Russia who really hate Medvedev. They think that he's a fifth columnist and so on. I don't think he is. He wouldn't have been by Putin's side so many years if Putin suspected him of being a fifth columnist. But it is true that when Medvedev and Putin did their swap in 2008, because they had the two term limits, and then so Putin was gone, and so they made their swap, and Medvedev was president at the time. President, but he he made an absolutely disastrous decision on Libya. It was obvious what NATO wanted to do in Libya. This was going to be a rerun of Iraq. It was a rerun of Yugoslavia. This UN Security Council resolution that the US, UK, France put forward, the whole idea that it was just there in order to save lives. We're just there to save lives. We'll have an arms ban for Libya. It was always obvious that this UN resolution would be used to enable NATO bombing, and I still don't understand how Medvedev could have been so naive not to realize what was behind this UN Security Council resolution. Because as soon as the Security Council resolution was adopted, boom, NATO started bombing Libya. There was nothing in the resolution enabling the bombing, but once that resolution was adopted, we intend to save civilian lives. That's NATO. Okay, well, how do we save civilian lives? Well, by bombing civilians. That's always the NATO solution. It was obvious that this is what they were going to do, and Medvedev, who was the president at the time, didn't veto the resolution. He should have vetoed the resolution, but he didn't do it. He just abstained. That put paid to the idea that Medvedev was going to have 2 terms, and Putin decided he was going to come back, and he did come back in 2012. But that because Medvedev just made a complete hash of what was an important issue. So I don't know. I'm baffled. As I say, I'm baffled why Primakov was flying to the United States when it was obvious that the bombing of Yugoslavia was about to take place at any moment. And I'm baffled by how Medvedev could have abstained on that UN Security Council resolution when it was obvious what NATO's intent was. So what I'm saying is that it's not impossible that once Putin's gone, whether through ill health or anything else, whoever comes after him may be a very ineffectual, weak, useless person. It could be another Gorbachev. I mean, we can't rule these things out. Who'd have thunk that when Gorbachev came to power in 1985, again, he seemed like a young man, and it was, oh, good. Well, now it's this is the end of the gerontocracy, the guys, the Brezhnevites, all the people who had come to power in the Soviet Union, who had started, basically there was kind of Stalin's henchmen, they come to these positions of power in the late 1930s following Stalin's purges, but then they stayed on, and while they were young then, by the early 1980s, they'd become very old men. So, people thought Gorbachev would be kind of he was young and a tough guy. I mean, he'd be, he's going to try and reinvigorate communism. That obviously these old men like Brezhnev, they couldn't reinvigorate communism, or maybe Gorbachev would. And then that's 1985. Within 6 years, there was no Soviet Union. Boom, gone. I mean, it's like, you think, how on earth can you have a system that brings forward people who just simply let the whole thing go in 6 years? I mean, just boom, that's it, we lost it. I mean, it's really a joke. So what I'm saying is that it's possible that after Putin, we're going to get, yet another kind of Gorbachev-like figure who's saying, hey, well, maybe we can improve relations with the West, where, Russia's really a Western power, we have Western culture, Western civilization, maybe, Putin had just made things, unnecessarily bad with the West, you've been too belligerent, too insistent on the rights of the Russian people. He picked fights with NATO. It was just unnecessary. To do it. Maybe let's go back to being friendly. Let's go to Brussels and have a nice cocktail party with all those lovely people, and stop all this. I don't know, Dostoevsky and insistence on the uniqueness of Russian culture and Russian civilization. So it's possible. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's not a wholly unrealistic for the Americans, the British, the Westerners just to say, okay, this is hopeless. We're not going to get anywhere with Putin. Let's just wait him out. He can't go on forever. We'll wait 10 years. He'll be an old man by then. Somebody younger will come along, and then there'll be a kind of a new Gorbachev. All right, so let's look at some of these questions. So we have Dexter Berry, who managed to remember the name of Sally Yates. It says Robert Barnes says Eternal Truth #2. Sally Yates is corrupt. Yep, absolutely right. #1, Jeffrey Epstein didn't kill himself. That one I don't know. I mean, I don't discount. I mean, it does seem amazing that he could have pulled that off, just committing suicide. So and it does, but I don't know, how strong the evidence for that is. I mean, this is you have a high-profile prisoner, and he kills himself. I mean, it's imagine this happens somewhere else. Imagine again in Russia, you have a high-profile prisoner, and then he killed himself. Who's going to believe it? I mean, I remember when in South Africa when they had Steve Biko. He was a more of a kind of a black power figure in South Africa. He wasn't actually a member of the ANC, but he was in police custody, and then they insisted, he killed himself. Of course he wasn't. He didn't kill himself. He was murdered. But when they came out with the story, he was in police custody, and he killed himself. I mean, no one in the world would believe such nonsense, and no one, of course, believed it. And then we have Dr. Lin says, have you discussed the Biden cartel to Ukraine and Russian pipeline with Germany? I clearly see the conflict. Yeah, I mean, I think that the Biden Ukraine connection is just shocking. It is shocking at every level. It's shocking that the United States has a cadre of characters, well-connected figures, who go to another country and just loot it. They just loot the country. I mean, Hunter Biden, knew nothing about Russia, Ukraine, doesn't speak any of the languages, didn't know anything about gas. gets himself this job in Burisma, and then he starts making, about a million a year. Now, why are they paying him $1 million a year? I mean, not because he's such a competent person. They're paying him because that's essentially, they're lobbying the United States. It's a way of channeling money to the United States. I mean, Burisma wanted the criminal charges against it, Burisma, dismissed. How did they do it? They did it by using Hunter Biden as a conduit to his father, who would then lean on Ukraine government to stop the investigation of Burisma. And that's what Biden did. I mean, that's what he did. He went there to Ukraine and said, "You got to fire this prosecutor." Now, the idiotic U.S. media said, "Oh, well, he was just Biden was interested in corruption. He was very worried about corruption in Ukraine. That's why he wanted the prosecutor fired, because he didn't think he was pursuing this corruption investigation." I mean, what absolute ridiculous nonsense that they should have believed this stupid story that the reason why a sitting vice president comes to Ukraine and demands that Ukraine fires a prosecutor, and if he doesn't, then he's going to hold up this massive, multi-billion-dollar aid package just for that. No, you don't get this multi-billion-dollar aid package from the United States if you don't fire the prosecutor. So he did this, and this was already at the time when some newspapers had written about Burisma and the Burisma connection with Biden. So there was, Biden boasted of this, and you would have thought, hey, some, reporters were saying there's something very funny going on here. Why does the vice president care so much about a prosecutor? But what Biden did worked the oracle, because lo and behold, in less than 12 months, the whole Burisma investigation came to an end. That's it. It came to an end. And Hunter Biden could still collect his money. And of course, Hunter Biden was channeling this money to his father. I mean, that's clearly the way this whole Biden family operation works. I mean, it's basically, after all, they're using essentially the name, that they are related to a very powerful figure in Washington. This is a man who's been in the Senate for nearly 40 years, from 1972 through to 2008. He was there for nearly 40 years. He had headed the Foreign Relations Committee, he headed the Judiciary Committee, and then he became vice president. So the entire family was essentially trading on the name. To the big man. This is how they sold themselves to clients. Hey, I'm a Biden, and and Biden is a big shot in Washington. And of course, the quid pro quo was that they had to send whatever was 10% for the big guy. I mean, that's how the family worked. I mean, you got 10% for the big guy after all, and he deserves it after all. It's his name that they were trading off. So I'll take that. So that I mean, it's the same thing with the Hunter Biden, the $500,000 that he gets for his artwork. I mean, can you imagine? Hunter Biden, not an artist, never done any painting in his life. So he has his exhibition, and he sells his artworks for $500,000. Now, why would people pay $500,000 for artwork by Hunter Biden? Well, $500,000 is what you pay for a sketch by Matisse. Some sketch by Picasso would probably fetch $500,000. And then lo and behold, it goes to Hunter Biden. A pay as play scheme. Or players pay scheme. Yeah, it's hard to say. All right, got another super chat from Spectrum in the air. Thank you so much, Spectrum. It's very, very generous of you. Thank you. He said, alarming, the two standards, elites versus deplorables. Biden involved the CCP in addition to Ukraine. Hunter Biden laptop, anyone tech oligarchs kept laptop secret. Yeah, I mean, all of that is absolutely correct. I mean, the story of the laptop was kept from the American public. This was a deliberate attempt by big tech, because they were so determined to ensure that Biden win the election, and they were so terrified. To be fair, they were also frightened that if the revelations about the laptop became well known, then Biden may lose the election, and big tech will be blamed, just like big tech was blamed for allegedly losing the election for Hillary Clinton, and they were just terrified that they don't want Congress coming after them after the 2020 election in the way that Congress came after them after the 2016 election. So they said, no, we're just going to close it down, and that's it. They closed down Twitter and Facebook, closed down the New York Post account. So to try to prevent, to the best extent that they could, the story about Hunter Biden's laptop coming out. I mean, it was an absolutely shocking act of censorship, it's when you really think about this, I mean, what they did, and then subsequently when they deplatformed President Trump, it's an extraordinary act of censorship. Now they, the big tech, hide behind the fact, well, we're private companies. We're private companies. We can do what like. We have a First Amendment right. The First Amendment applies to us. We have a right to deplatform anyone, to ban anyone, to kick anyone off, because we have a First Amendment right to express ourselves. Well, they don't. When they have that great a power over speech, when they control such a huge percentage of speech, I mean, basically, their platforms is where people conduct all the intellectual transactions. Then, yeah, then clearly the First Amendment doesn't apply to them. The First Amendment applies to the public, and the public has a right to free speech. And so the notion of the First Amendment applies to us, we giant corporations, we giant internet agencies, that it applies to us. We're billionaires. We're able to control speech. And you can't censor us, but we can censor somebody else. So that's basically that's just not the way the Supreme Court has ruled in the past, because essentially when you have that kind of power, it essentially is the same as the government having that kind of power. And since the First Amendment prohibits government from just banning speech, so the internet giants, should also not have the power to ban speech that they don't like. So we have another super chat from Spectre in the air. Thank you so much, Spectre. Very, very kind of you. So it says, big tech threat to world freedom. Love CCP, authoritarian power. Oligarchs need to be dealt with, similar to how Putin did. Too much power to too few. I really do agree with you. I mean, I think that we are in a position, not unlike the position in Russia with the oligarchs, when we have the various of these internet giants that are so powerful, so beyond any control by democratic forces, that something needs to be done, because you really cannot have speech controlled in this way. You can't have 2-3 of these internet giant saying, okay, well, we're not going to allow a president, a former president who won 74 million votes, we're not going to allow him to communicate to his supporters because we don't like him. You know, we don't like his politics. We don't like him. We're just not going to allow it. It's just you can't do this. This really is getting into the realm of the Russian oligarchs, when you had people so powerful that they could just control speech, and they control the election. I mean, you have someone like Zuckerberg, who knows how much money he poured into that election, and he did it with one view only: to ensure a democratic victory. So he did it by creating these drop boxes. But if you're going to do that, and because you're so worried about the lack of drop boxes in this election, then it has to be done nationally, and it has to be done in a fair way. But that's not what Mark Zuckerberg did. I mean, Zuckerberg put the drop boxes, the overwhelming majority of these drop boxes, in Democratic districts. I mean, he did it in order to boost the Democratic vote. I mean, so he did it in a way. It was a massive amount of money that he poured in order to ensure a Democratic victory. So this is very like the oligarchs in Russia that stole the election, the 1996 election for Boris Yeltsin. So all those characters like Boris Berezovsky, I mean, that's exactly what they did. They basically they had so much money, and Yeltsin was their guy. And so, they knew Yeltsin was heading for defeat. So they just poured a lot of money into that election and stole it, with, of course, help from the United States. So something like this clearly happened in 2020. I mean, it was quite shocking. Okay. All right. Well, I think we've gone on for quite a while. I think it's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for all of your questions and comments. Above all, thank you so much for those who contributed to the super chats. I really appreciate it. It's very, very kind of you. Makes all of this a lot more fun and more free flowing when the coins are dropping. So that's always nice. Anyway, thank you so much. We will be here same time next Saturday, and hope you'll be able to join us. And again, come with all your questions and ideas and suggestions. All of it is great, a lot of fun. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.